Hey everybody, I'm Natasha Kirchuk, and thanks for joining us for ILTV's weekly program, One-on-One with Alan Dershowitz. We want to give you, our viewers, a chance to have your questions answered by Professor Dershowitz, one of America's greatest legal minds. He's a leading expert on criminal and constitutional law, civil liberties, and the Arab-Israeli conflict. Hi, Professor Dershowitz.
Hi, Natasha. First of all, a big mazel tov for you. You're getting married soon. This is your last
Very
show.
soon. It is my last show of being a free woman.
I've met your chatan, and you will be eating well over the years. And I just want to wish you a great, great life and a very hearty mazel tov.
Toda raba, Professor Dershowitz. All right, so we have an amazing guest list here today, but I'd like to begin with asking you a question about your recent visit to Israel. I mean, you just completed this visit to Israel in over a week. You attended the opening of the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem as a guest of the Trump administration. You met with Prime Minister Netanyahu and several members of the cabinet. You met with the IDF chief of staff and spent an hour with his deputy and visited the Gazan border, where you went into a new Hamas terror tunnel, like the one that was destroyed recently. And you also took a helicopter ride to the north and got a briefing on the situation on the Golan Heights, where the Iranians are struggling to establish control. Now, this is just a partial list of what was essentially a private tour. So what impressed you the most about your recent visit to Israel?
Well, of course, the low point of my visit was swimming in the Dead Sea, and the high point was being in a helicopter above the Golan Heights. But beyond that, what impressed me so much was the consensus in Israel, the joy of Jerusalem finally being recognized as the legitimate and enduring capital of Israel. There were people of every background in Israel. The issue is a little bit more controversial in the United States, because in the United States, everything is, are you for Trump or against Trump? And anything Trump does is regarded as terrible by those who oppose him, and anything he does is regarded as excellent by those who support him. So there has been some opposition, not to the move itself, but to the timing of the move. But I didn't really see that in Israel. I saw tremendous joy. I also saw a determination to keep Iran out of Israel militarily. And I think the decision to attack the Iranian missile launchers made peace and quiet more likely. I think it sent a very powerful message. Of course, you couldn't have been there without shedding tears for innocent people who were killed in Gaza. Every one of those deaths was the fault of Hamas. Hamas uses what I call the dead baby strategy. It sends children and women and old people into harm's way as human shields to protect Hamas terrorists. On the last day of the riots, the day that I was there, 50 of the some 60-odd people who were killed, according to Hamas, were Hamas members. Of course, they have to say that now because they're criticized by their own people for sending innocent civilians to their deaths while not risking the lives of Hamas members. So, you know, it was a very substantive trip for me. It was a great joy to bring my grandson to Israel for the first time. We had a wonderful time. Of course, I met with the Prime Minister and greeted the President and had some time with various military leaders. And, you know, my pride in Israel and its determination to protect its civilians is only renewed. And so for me, it was just a wonderful, wonderful visit.
Well, with all of the external security threats to Israel, I understand that you found that one of the most important issues was the internal threat to the status of the Israeli Supreme Court. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
No, I wouldn't say that was one of the most serious threats. Israel's a democracy. It will handle it. I don't approve of the legislation that's now pending. I think the Supreme Court of Israel is a jewel of its democratic institutions. When I defend Israel around the world, I always point to the decisions of the Supreme Court, the fact that Israel, more than any other country, surrounded by enemies of the kind Israel is surrounded by, complies with the rule of law, observes human rights and civil liberties. Just today, the Israel Supreme Court barred the exclusion of a human rights person from Israel. The Israel Supreme Court is an absolutely necessary institution, and its independence must be preserved. But I don't agree with the leader of the opposition who said that if this legislation is enacted, Israel will turn into Erdogan's Turkey. It won't. Democracy lies in the heart and the soul and the neshama of its citizens. Israel is a democracy by its very nature. Turkey is not, and Turkey is willing to accept authoritarian rule, theological rule. So comparisons between Israel and Turkey are not apt. One should not overstate the objection to these statutes, but I think the statutes do pose a danger to the independence of the Israeli judiciary, which poses in turn a danger to Israel's democratic institutions.
Well, Professor Dershowitz, while you were here, you were also interviewed on Israel's leading news program to talk about an initiative started by member of Knesset Yoel Razvozov, who himself was a member of Israel's Olympic judo team. Judo is an important branch of sport here in Israel, where Israelis have earned more Olympic medals than in any other sport. In fact, in the recent European Championship held in Tel Aviv, Israel won a lion's share of gold and other medals. Despite this, in recent competitions, Israelis have been forced to compete without the Israeli flag embroidered on their uniform, and this has actually happened in lots of other sports as well. For example, even when an Israeli won a gold medal in Abu Dhabi, the Israeli flag was not raised and the anthem of the International Judo Federation was played instead of Hatikvah. All this is in clear violation of the spirit of international competition and the letter of the Olympic Charter. And Professor, you recently met with Yoel to see if we could put a stop to this continuing discrimination against Israel. Let's hear from him.
Hello, Mr. Dershowitz. Thanks for our meeting. As you remember, the Olympic Charter clearly states that there is no role for discrimination based on national or religious identity. Despite all this, in recent years, countries who host international events in a range of sport ignore these clauses and discriminate against our Israeli athletes. In some cases, Israeli athletes have been refused entry to the country where the event is held. In other cases, Israeli athletes have been forced to compete under international banner rather than their own. I believe this behavior constitutes a breach of the Olympic Charter and is a blatant case of discrimination. The authority to tackle this ongoing discrimination sits with the Court of Arbitration for Sport, which can put an end to this once and for all. This could be a major international victory for Israel in the diplomatic arena, and we can think of no one better than you to work with us on this. Therefore, I want to thank you for supporting our lawsuit.
Well, I thank you very much for bringing it to the attention of the world. I'm happy to participate in the legal challenge in front of the sports court. But I think we also have to add to that diplomatic, economic, and other kinds of pressures. I don't believe the United States should agree to participate in any athletic event from which Israel is banned, just like the United States would not participate in events at the United Nations from which Israel is banned. Certainly they should do the same with sports. I would think other countries would do the same. This is not only about discrimination involving Israel. It's about the integrity of sport. It's about whether or not Israel is subjected to a double standard. Because if the world gets away with imposing a double standard on Israel in sports, the next step will be in other areas of life. This is part of the BDS campaign. And indeed, it's part of an effort to delegitimate Israel and deny it equal rights. I see some improvement. When I was in Qatar not so long ago, an Israeli participated in a tennis event, the Doha Open, and they played Hatikva, and they allowed him to accept the medal under a flag. But that's a rare exception. At the same time, the Saudis forbade an Israeli chess player from participating. So this has to come to an end. And I am honored to participate with you and others, with great athletes. I wish I were a great athlete. That was always my aspiration. If I wasn't going to be a law professor, I wanted to be a point guard on the Boston Celtics. But Hashem didn't endow me with the ability to shoot three-pointers. So I'm happy to participate in the talent that I do have in helping to bring this important matter in front of all the appropriate legal and other authorities.
All right, well, Professor Dershowitz, joining us now in this studio are two guests who will help you return to your home turf and favorite battleground of all, the campus. We're pleased to have Avigail Benstein, president of the World Union of the Jewish Students, as well as Shaila Piesman, an activist of the German Union of Jewish Students. And before we begin, Avigail, could you tell us a little bit about your organization?
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having us. We're honored to be here. So WUJS is the democratically elected leadership of the Jewish student body around the world. Shaila here is from Germany, and she represents JSUD, which is the Jewish Union of Jewish students in Germany. And similarly, there are Jewish student unions and independent associations all over the world that are nationally elected leaderships, and they elect the international leadership. And so we've been around since 1924. Our first president was Albert Einstein. Other interesting people who were involved are David Ben-Gurion and Sigmund Freud and Weizmann. So we have a long history of fighting for equality, fighting for Jewish student rights and anti-discrimination, but also fighting for human rights in general and trying to do things that are good for the world.
Well, Avigail, I know that you actually have a question for Professor Dershowitz yourself, so go ahead, ask him.
Hi, thank you for meeting with us, Professor Dershowitz.
Sure.
It's an honor. So many Jewish students around the world find themselves in a position where they have to defend Israel's actions and policies, whether they want to or not. And a lot of times expectation is coming from the Israeli government as well as their peers in whichever country they are. And oftentimes they don't necessarily agree with Israel and its policies, and they feel increasingly disenfranchised by the government. And I wondered, what do you think we can do to bridge that gap, not just between Jewish students and the Israeli government, but Jewish students and Israelis as well?
Well, I think the gap is a real potential for helping Israel. Israel is a democracy, and so is your organization. And you don't have to take orders from any particular government or accept any particular policy. For me, whenever I defend Israel, I make what I call the 80% case. The case involving Israel's right to thrive and exist as the nation state of the Jewish people, not to be subjected to a double standard, to be treated fairly in the world. That doesn't mean that I agree with every single Israeli policy. You heard me criticizing the attempt to limit the independence of the Supreme Court. I do think that it's important to defend Israel's security issues, security policies. I don't approve of armchair generals, many of whom think they can do better what Israel is doing. I've met with so many of the generals and leaders of the IDF. These are good people who try so hard to do the right thing, and they have so much more information than we do. But even there is room for criticism, constructive criticism. Take the issue of the Gaza fence. I mean, we're all distressed by the fact that there were innocent people killed, even though that's the way Hamas works it out. That's part of their goal to do it. But I think we can feel comfortable saying that Israel should devote more time figuring out non-lethal responses to challenges, whether it be the challenge of the Turkish flotilla ship or the Gaza rioters. I call them lynchers, actually, because their goal was to lynch Israeli children. They had maps giving them the quickest way to various kibbutzim and daycare centers and other things. So I just think that your obligation is always to tell the truth and never to lose your credibility. And that means being sometimes critical of Israeli policies. I think that gives you more credibility as well. So I don't see it as a conflict. One reason that I like being independent is I don't have to seek permission from the Israeli government to say anything, and neither do you. And I think that's an advantage and a virtue and also a help in making the case for Israel. So may you go from strength to strength, continue to do what you're doing, and keep your eye on just one word, emet, truth, veritas. That's the key to defending Israel. You don't have to lie to defend Israel. You do have to lie to defend Hamas and Hezbollah. But the virtue of defending Israel is you can tell the truth, you can do it openly, democratically, and critically, and still say Israel deserves to be supported as the nation state of the Jewish people.
Now, I'd like to turn to our guest, Shaila, here. You're from Germany. What is the most pressing problem in your eyes that the Jewish community in Germany is currently facing?
Thank you. Hi, Professor Dershowitz. It's an honor to talk to you. So I would like to ask you about your opinion on what's going on in Europe. We are facing a rising anti-Semitism coming from different directions, like the far right, the far left, but also parts of the refugees and parts of, like, extreme parts of the Muslim community in general. How would you deal with that?
Well, it's a great question, and I'm glad you put your finger on the fact that we hear anti-Semitic tropes from the hard right and the hard left. This is not the first time in history that's happened. Obviously, Jews have been caught between the black and the red for generations, the black of fascism, the red of communism. Both Stalin and Hitler hated Jews and murdered many. Hitler, obviously, many, many more than Stalin, but Stalin murdered many Jews, including Jewish intellectuals and poets and writers, and political officials. So Jews need to move toward the center, need to move governments toward the center. And what we're seeing in Europe is a movement of both extremes. The right is moving much, much further to the ultra-nationalistic right in Eastern Europe and Greece and other places, and the left is moving further to the left, as evidenced by Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party in England. And Jews in Israel are stuck with a weakened center. I think we were all gratified to see the center hold in France in the most recent election, and the center, to some degree, is holding in Germany, where you have a terrific centrist chancellor and government for the most part. But it's very, very important to expose anti-Semitism both on the left and the right. We see too much tolerance by people of the left, of left-wing anti-Semitism of the kind of Farrakhan or Jeremy Corbyn, and we see too much tolerance by people on the right of anti-Semitism on the right. For example, some of the countries that are most anti-Semitic, Hungary and Poland, are very pro-Israel. And we cannot let that be an excuse for tolerating the increasing anti-Semitism and nationalism. The Israeli government may have to be cautious in how it deals with other governments, but you as an individual or as a student leader, a student activist, can demand a zero tolerance toward anti-Semitism of the right and of the left. And I think exposure is critically important. And I think people of the left have a special obligation to attack anti-Semitism from the left, and people of the right have a special obligation to attack anti-Semitism from the right. So keep doing the great work that I know you're doing.
Professor Dershowitz, can I ask a follow-up question to this?
Sure.
Oftentimes, there's this feeling that the Jewish community is on their own and they only care about anti-Semitism, when in fact, anti-Semitism is a symptom oftentimes of other types of hatred, other types of bigotry. How do you suggest the Jewish community bands with other communities that are also disenfranchised, other minorities, but also not fall into this trap of fear-mongering and hatred that's coming from the different sides?
It's a terrific question, one that I've had to face personally a lot. For example, I've devoted so much of my life to defending the rights of African Americans, particularly the rights of African Americans not to be treated discriminatorily by the legal system. I wrote many, many briefs. I marched with the civil rights movement, but I have now publicly disassociated myself from the organization Black Lives Matter, because Black Lives Matter has as part of its platform singling out Israel and calling it a genocidal and apartheid state, and saying that no city in the United States should allow its police people to be trained only in Israel. They don't single out Brazil or Argentina or Belarus or you name it, countries which have horrendous records of police abuse, only Israel. That's pure and simple anti-Semitism. So I think we have to draw the line and have zero tolerance for becoming associated with any organization that promotes anti-Semitism, while at the same time supporting the causes that they support. We should support, with small letters, Black Lives Matter, but we should not support the organization Black Lives Matter. The same thing is true, I think, with support of Muslims in Europe and refugees. We should support their rights, but not necessarily some of the organizations which promote their rights, which also promote anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. It's a difficult line to walk, but I think we have to do it. We must have zero tolerance for anti-Semitism, and we must not allow the anti-Semitism of the hard left to deny us the right to defend the most basic human rights, even of those people who are critical and discriminatory against us.
Well, I'd like to also speak about something that is very much related to European and Israeli relations and how the Jewish community is intertwined in all of this. Israel has just won the 2018 Eurovision. This means that the International Song Contest is supposed to be held in Jerusalem in 2019. But now there are rumors that may not be happening. The Eurovision has actually just released a tweet advising fans not to go booking their flights just yet because the time and location of the 2019 event has yet to be set. So it seems like the event may be becoming politicized somehow.
Well, first of all, only Israel would be treated this way. If the event were won by a woman from Erdogan's Turkey or Belarus, which is a repressive fascistic regime, or Putin's Russia, people would be cheering it. It's only about the nation state of the Jewish people. It is pure, overt anti-Semitism. And why should we be surprised? Europe has a history of anti-Semitism that goes back millennia. People feel that even during the Holocaust, countries differed in their anti-Semitism, and they did. But countries like Holland performed horribly, and they get away with murder because of the Anne Frank and Frank story. Even the good countries, Bulgaria, did deport their non-citizens. Almost no country in Europe should be proud of the way it handled Nazism and the Shoah and the Holocaust. So why should we be surprised if the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the people who brought us the Shoah still have lingering anti-Semitism? In the 40 or 50 years after the Shoah, there was so much guilt that the anti-Semitism got hidden and indeed was made criminal in some countries. But today that statute of limitations is over, and the true feelings of many Europeans, not all, not even most, but many Europeans, are coming out. And of course the hard left gives a cover because they claim it's anti-Zionism, not anti-Semitism. Israel cannot accept the double standard. If the event is not held in Jerusalem, it should not be held at all. And people should refuse to participate in an event which is discriminatory in nature. If you allow and tolerate a double standard even once, even in a song contest, it begins to spread to other areas. So, look, it's a moment of joy for Israel, but Israel can never experience joy without there being a negative attached to it.
Yeah, well, the one thing I would like to mention is that it was the people who ultimately voted for Neta Barzilai and brought Israel to its championship. So
no, of course, that's why it's such a mixed picture. This was a popular vote, and if she were the same person and not Israeli, she probably would have gotten more votes because probably some votes were influenced by BDS and other efforts to try to create a cultural boycott against Israel. But Israel has to fight back. Look, I've always said the best answer to BDS is for Israel to produce products that the world can't do without, and that applies to culture as well. If Israel
I don't know who else could kind of redo that type of performance, but unfortunately we have run out of time for today. Thank you so much for your time, Professor Dershowitz, and I would like to thank member of Knesset Yoel Razvozov and our studio guests Avigal Benstein and Shaila Piesman. If you would like Professor Dershowitz to answer your questions, go to ILTV or our Facebook page and submit them. We'll see you again next week.